Welcome back to another Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals podcast, better known as FPOG. This week, we're really excited because this question came from a listener, and it was about college funding. So if you have any requests for future episodes, be sure to send them in. We're excited to talk about that today. 3 things we're going to cover: contemplating and understanding the value of college. We'll talk in depth about 529 plans and some of the nuances and our philosophical ideas there. And lastly, we'll talk about a few various planning opportunities. But Justin, this week, I think since we're talking about college funding, a good place, and college planning, a good place to start would be, where'd you go to school and how do you come to make that decision?
Awesome. So I've wrote about this a few times in different articles on the site. I went to Kansas State in Manhattan, Kansas, known as the Little Apple. I am a huge Kansas State fan. Why did I go there? I have about 50 living relatives with degrees from Kansas State. Growing up, we had season tickets to K-State football, but we didn't just go to home games. We went to away games, a couple away games each year as well. So I am an enormous Kansas State fan. I could probably tell you very detailed information about a game from 1997, if that is something that interests you. So that's why I went to Kansas State. Huge Kansas State fan. How about you, Jared?
Yeah, I went to University of Arkansas. We've talked about that a little bit, but how I came to choose it, I actually moved to Memphis, Tennessee, going into my junior year of high school from Los Angeles, which I wouldn't recommend, a bit of a culture shock, but I made a few friends while at school, finishing up high school in Memphis, and I wanted to stay close to home. And as an out-of-state student applying to California schools, your odds go from pretty low to pretty much impossible. So it was a good option to stay close to home and not have to remake friends, because I switched schools in high school. So it was a good spot, and I loved my 4 years at the University of Arkansas, and I live in that same town. So it's a great place to go to school and to live. So all right, with that, let's jump right into it. So Justin, first thing we're talking about is really the value of a college degree, and I think this is something that I think is becoming a lot better, because I think there was a generation that said, hey, just get a degree. It's an investment. And while yes, that's true, most of the research shows that, college educated professionals make more than their peers that do not have at least a bachelor's degree. There's some nuance there, and the disparity between public universities and private universities. You could spend $250,000 easily on the cost of a 4-year university. So understanding the value really matters, and a couple of resources that we've found that have been great on that is Ron Lieber's book, The Price You Pay for College. It's really its own rabbit hole to kind of understand what people are paying, what the advertised cost is versus what the final cost is. It really is a bit of a black box, but I think something that's helpful there is understanding, okay, what is the degree going to cost you, getting a clear sense of that, and resources like Ron Lieber's book will kind of help you begin to understand that process. But then also, what are the prospects after school in light of the potential degree that's going to be received? What does someone expect to make, and what is the cost of getting that degree and the potential earnings? So that's a good framework. But there's also a more qualitative component, which is the soft skills that are learned and the relationships that are built that becomes much more difficult to quantify. So both of those things are kind of related in understanding the value of a degree. But Justin, I kind of need to defer to you on this, because Lauren just kind of finalized her law school decision, and you probably had a lot of this going through your head. You want to talk with our listeners a little more about that?
Yes, this is something we never saw on our horizon when we got married. But Lauren, my wife, has always been interested in law school, and our kids are at an age where they're really getting into the elementary area. And so, we're coming out of this stage of life that's just pure chaos, trying to keep your head above water with a bunch of young kids in the house. And now that they're going to school, the question became, okay, so what do we want this stage of our life to look like? And Lauren, my wife, was really interested in going to law school. And the pandemic was just starting. Well, really, we had kind of started down this path even before the pandemic began, and really just felt like we wanted to explore our options and see what happened there. a couple different huge shifts happened. So, I mentioned we thought about this before the pandemic. So our thought there was, okay, let's go to Houston. And then the pandemic happened and law schools went remote last year. And then work also went remote. And so then we started thinking, well, maybe we could go anywhere. And she ended up getting a really good score on the LSAT. And so, long story short, we were evaluating a wide spectrum of options. So, paint the picture. Kind of on the high end, we were thinking about Washington University in St. Louis, as well as Notre Dame. And so, both of those are just excellent law schools. And on the kind of middle end of the spectrum, or really just more affordable options, we were thinking about Baylor, SMU, Houston, and Texas A&M, and the University of Arkansas. Just like Jared, my wife went to the University of Arkansas for undergrad. So we had this huge decision on our hands because on one hand, Notre Dame is a really expensive school, but it's an excellent law school. Wash U in St. Louis is an even better school. And Lauren ended up getting a terrific scholarship to Wash U. It was not a full ride, but it was more than half of tuition. But still, with that being said, this was going to be a six-figure cost. When it was all said and done, we had a couple private schools that we were looking at in St. Louis for our younger kids. And so with tuition plus some of the private school costs, it was going to be a big expense. But the flip side of that is in law school, it is cut and dry. Going to a better school, if you're interested in working at a big law firm, the payoff is really obvious. And so, long story short, if she would have gone to Wash U, well, I mean, she could almost certainly, as long as you just graduate and pass the bar, she could probably work at a big law firm in Texas. Big law market's pretty big in Texas, Dallas, Houston, and Austin. So the point I'm getting at is the cost benefit analysis was pretty obvious. Even though we were going to spend a lot of money, I mean, say with Notre Dame, we would have spent $120,000 total for a degree at Notre Dame. They gave a small scholarship, but still huge cost to go to Notre Dame. But the benefit is pretty obvious. It's pretty enormous. Lauren ended up receiving a full ride at Texas A&M. And so that is our choice. We chose Texas A&M over WashU Notre Dame, as well as over the Baylor, SMU, Houston options. And so the full ride at A&M certainly made the decision a little bit easy from a financial standpoint. Obviously, free is a really good price, but it's interesting because there's kind of a lot of aspects to cover with a decision like this. We are technically leaving money on the table, even though WashU and Notre Dame would have been really expensive schools. It would have most likely been a home run. Lauren could have gotten a job at a big law firm in Texas, and it would have been a pretty fantastic scenario for her income. Now, the difficulty there is sometimes you don't make every decision to maximize your personal financial situation. And this was our situation entirely. We're in a situation where right now, all of our family's income comes from Brownlee Wealth Management. Lauren's been a stay-at-home mom for the past 7 years. Really, really good mom. And with this future decision, it is a scenario where there is a cost-benefit financial analysis, but there's also this reality where we don't necessarily know if we want Lauren to work at a big law firm. Lauren doesn't necessarily know if that's exactly what she wants to do. Where she works is obviously 3 years into the future after law school's finished. But we did know that it was a worthy endeavor. And as the kids go to school, this is a really good time for Lauren to go back to law school. And she could potentially have 4 or 5 decades of work in front of her. So even though it's non-traditional, even though she kind of took a much later stage in life going to law school than most, we knew that it was something that seemed like a great idea and something we're really excited about. But we also didn't want to move our family to a completely new state and spend a lot of money on a degree when, in our situation, I'm probably still going to be the primary source of income. That's our personal situation. And so if we were just trying to make decisions that maximize the bottom line and that made the most amount of money, we would be moving to South Bend, Indiana, or to St. Louis, Missouri, and we would be going to WashU or Notre Dame. But it just makes a lot more sense for us to stay in Texas. Partly because, I say that, with our business with Brownlee Wealth Management, the pandemic showed that we could easily live anywhere. I used to joke with people, we could live in Europe and run this business because of the pandemic. It's kind of funny. All of the clients that we have in the Woodlands never schedule in-person meetings. Truly never. They always do Zoom. But I think that's here to stay because, I think our meetings are great and I'm confident we're providing a lot of value. But if you're a client, you've got a busy life and it's a whole lot easier for you to jump on Zoom real quick, get it done, get what you need, and then move on and go to the next thing. And so I think we could have lived anywhere, but it's still just from a personal and from a business standpoint, it makes so much more sense for us to stay in Texas. And so that decision of what is a degree worth, how do you make the decision of where to go for college? It's a personal one for us. It's one that we just made. And, for us, we kind of weighed some of the pros and cons and ended up taking a decision that we didn't really think we were going to take 6 months ago, but we're thrilled about it now.
Yeah. Congrats to Lauren. That's really awesome. And I love this example because it really gets down to the crux of like what financial planning is. Financial planning isn't optimizing your finances. It's optimizing your life and considering the financial outcomes, right? Which are two very different things, right? Like if we were just optimizing finances, we'd never tell clients to take the vacation. We'd never tell clients to take the reduction in hours for self-care. We'd never give them permission to do the things that make life worth living. So I love your anecdote. And so that's really kind of what we're doing. And that's the lens with which we approach that. So now that we've kind of begun to scratch the surface of value, which is such a difficult thing to quantify, let's talk about the 529 plan. So to kind of set the stage, the 529 plan is really the most common funding mechanism for education and college expenses for undergrad education. So that's where we're going to start. Technically, there's what's called a Coverdell, which is an education savings account, but the contribution limits are so small that usually it doesn't make sense, and the 529's superior. So we're really going to focus our time there. And then the only other caveat I paint before we get started is college funding should always take a back seat to you being in a good position financially. You can borrow for the cost of college, but you cannot borrow for retirement. And so kind of some of the strategies and things we're discussing, what really your financial house should be in order, and you should feel good and clear about your direct time. So with that, Justin, what would you say about the 529 plan as it relates to a lot of our clients or people in Texas who work for oil and gas companies?
So many considerations with the 529. Okay, so your state matters a lot. Generally speaking, what is a 529? Think of it like a Roth IRA. So you put money into a Roth IRA, you don't get any tax benefit, right? There's no tax benefit up front, but your money grows tax-free. And as long as you follow the rules, you can take the money out tax-free. So 529, very similar. Why does your state matter? Well, a 529, even though it is basically a Roth IRA from that standpoint, if you're in a state that has income tax, so state income tax, I grew up in Kansas, Kansas has a state income tax. If that's your situation, then you need to be a little bit specific with which 529 you utilize, because you will likely have a state income tax benefit for choosing that state's 529 plan. And so being in Texas, and kind of funny, we now have clients in, I think, 2 countries and a handful of states. So obviously most of our clients are in Texas, but we now are serving clients all over. So if you're in Texas, if you're in Florida, or the other few states that don't have a state income tax, don't really need to worry about which 529 to utilize. But if you are in a state that has an income tax, you need to be aware of that. And there's some planning considerations to not just get the Roth IRA tax benefit with a 529, but also get a deduction as well.
That's right. And, if you are in an income tax-free state, the value it's not eliminated, but it's greatly reduced, right? Because the thing about a 529 plan is in the event you need those funds for non-education expenses and you withdraw them and use them for anything else, you're subject to a potential penalty on those dollars. So that's something you need to think about. And kind of related to that in managing the penalty, what percent would you fund? Would you put 100% of the future cost of college? Because that's one of the things that I wrestle with as clients, especially in regards to clients with young kids. There's just so many unknown variables, right? Coronavirus has shown us what's the value of going in person versus doing classes virtually. There's increasing alternative career paths, whether it's coding, boot camps, or alternative certification programs that are growing in popularity and income earning potential. And there's also a lack of clarity around scholarships and what school your kid may want to go to. So what percentage would you fund? Would you try to fully fund, or what are some considerations as you think about, let's say you have an amount and an estimated future cost based on what you think you would like to contribute to a kid's plan? How much would you put in there?
Let me first just answer it really directly and then give some thoughts. Okay, so direct answer. If your kid's really young right now, and there's a high probability that you will at some point send your kid to private school, so K through 12 private school, by the way, not just college. If that's your situation, fund it as much as you possibly can. Put $75,000 in there. You're allowed to front load it. We'll talk about that in the next point. But put as much as you possibly can. Who cares how much college will cost? Just put as much money in that 529 as you can if all of your other financial house is in order and you already have significant savings for you personally. And I say that because here's what I want to expound on. Let's talk a little bit about some 529 facts and rules. Okay, so 529, it can be used for any expense related to education. Pretty lenient on those rules. So any expense, it can be textbooks, a laptop. So really any education expense. Also, 529, any education college expense. But 529, let's back up before college. Another critical rule to understand with 529, you can use 529 funds to pay for private school. So if you have tuition expenses, private school expenses, K through 12, you can utilize a 529 account to pay for those if that is in your best interest to do. By the way, we better make a quick point on that, Jared. Another, again, huge planning opportunity here. If you are not in Texas or Florida, again, really important to understand your state income tax and state 529 plan, because you theoretically, if you're doing private school, I mean, you should fund the 529 every year, get the tax deduction, and then pay for private school from that 529, even if you're not really investing those funds. Ooh, one other wrinkle that's important. 529 plans. Okay, you put a beneficiary as the 529. So just legal structure of a 529. It's an investment account, and you are going to have a designation as the owner of the investment account. And then you create a beneficiary. The beneficiary is your child or grandchild as well. So you can change the beneficiary at any time. You are not required to open a 529, put a beneficiary, and then it can only be used for that child. You can open a 529, and let's say that the first child gets a full ride somewhere and you don't need it. Well, you can change the beneficiary to the next child. And let's see, other key considerations. So that's the beneficiary. You can also name a investment account owner beneficiary. So essentially, if something happens to you, who is the adult who will be in charge of that account, even though they're not the beneficiary, because the child is the beneficiary.
Yeah, and I would just add with that the percentage you're comfortable funding should be a function of your values first and foremost, but then also because of the beneficiary flexibility, you can fund a little more aggressively, because if you have a family of 4 kids, the probability of, if you fully fund the education of one of them, the odds of those funds being needed across all 4 kids is exponentially higher than if you just have a single child. That's a big part of it. So,
real quick, did we cover contribution limits?
No, we didn't. You want to cover that before we talk about planning opportunities? Just setting the stage there.
All right. So 529 essentially just follows the IRS guidelines on gifting. So the annual gift exclusion, you're allowed to give $15,000 a year to your children if you want to. And technically, you can give that and your spouse can give it as well. So if you're married and you have 2 kids, you could theoretically put $30,000 a year into each kid's account. Little wrinkle. So 529 is a little bit unique in the sense that you are allowed to bunch 5 years of giving into 1 year. So you could 15,000 a year. You could put 75,000 into your child's account, and you need to properly record keep that on your tax return. And you need to remember that because you cannot give your child other money during that 5 year stretch, but you are allowed to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, just to kind of summarize, if you're in a state where there is state income tax, I would look at your plan, your 529 plan, and understand the potential state income tax deductions. And if you're in an income tax-free state, I would pick a 529 plan based on investment options. Utah is one that we've seen that's that we like, and the investment options are pretty good if you don't know where to start. Or you can, Google best 529 plans, and there's a lot of independent third parties that have reviewed that. But now that we've talked about, laid the groundwork of how the 529 functions, let's talk about some of the planning opportunities. And I think a good one to talk about is kind of related to the annual contribution amount. You touched on this earlier, the idea of super funding it. What is super funding a 529 plan, and why might you do that?
Okay, so money invested today is typically more valuable than money invested tomorrow. Why is that? It's really direct. It's really pretty common sense, simple. The stock market is up about 75, 80% of the time. And so if the stock market goes up more than it goes down, well, usually it's better to invest more money today than it is tomorrow. There is a small chance that you happen to invest a bunch of money and a market crash happens next year and you wish you wouldn't have. But most of the time, the market goes up. And so bunching 5 years into 1 year, especially if you have a young child, that allows you to put 75,000 in and then gives you the full benefit. Let's say they're 2 years old and you've got 16 years for that money to compound. You could have 150, 200,000 in that account without an enormous return rate each year. So pretty feasible to get there.
Yeah, and the one caveat I'll add is, I don't know the 74% number, that the odds of you having a positive return in the stock market increases, your time horizon increases. So whether or not the stock market is up, on a daily basis, I think it's up about, that number's closer to 55% of the time, 45% of the time it's down. So it's a little better than a coin flip. So if you have an 18-year-old who's going to be attending college in the fall, it may not be worth investing any money in the market. We'd likely advise against that, just because you don't have the time to endure any volatility. So that's really another consideration. It gives you more time in the market, but you don't, just because you can fund a 529 doesn't mean you have to. If your kids are in their early teenage years, and the cool thing about 529 plans is they'll have age-based funds where they'll get progressively more conservative as you approach as you approach college funding, which is a great thing. But you'll just want to keep in mind how to invest that money, and time horizon, just like in traditional investing, is a big part of your allocation and how much you put in. But to Justin's point, more time in the market is better than not. So super funding may be a good opportunity if you have the liquidity to do that, and if it doesn't jeopardize your plan.
Yes, quick 30-second point on that. Time frame should be a dictator of how you invest, right? Risk tolerance matters, but time frame is much more important. So your investments in a retirement account, very, very different than a 529. A 529, if it's used for college expenses, you are going to have a very clear date. College expenses start now and they end 4 or 5 years later, whatever it may be. It is very absolute. In retirement, it is not that way. You might retire when you're 62, but the next year you're maybe going to take 4 or 5% of your account. So no, you shouldn't drastically change how you're invested if you're properly diversified. In a 529, it has to be pretty extreme. So those age-based accounts, as you hit age 14, 15, they're going to get real safe real fast. And they should, because again, if you have a 16-year-old, no, you really can't put 60% of that in the stock market because market crashes will happen. Not an if, but a when. And if you're depending on that money to pay for college, well, that's a really risky scenario. And so again, time frame matters a ton on your portfolio here, much more than retirement even.
Yeah. And, that which gets into another point of opportunistically making distributions from the account. So, if you super fund a 529 for one of your kids and the first one goes to college and it's in a bear market, if you have the liquidity to pay out of pocket for those expenses and then use the 529 funds and change the beneficiary to your second child, that may make sense for you. But if you super fund the 529 plan and the market screams for 5 years and you've made a lot of interest and appreciation on your principal investment, it may be a good time to tap it. So that makes a difference.
Which also means that, some of the strategies, financial planning opportunities here is based on the age of your kids. So if you have kids that are 12, 10, and 8, well, it's kind of tough. Maybe you do just open one 529 account, you super fund it, and you invest it really aggressively. And you see, hey, I'm going to use this in 5 years. If it's even, well, maybe I'll just cash flow my college expenses at first, and I'll let that account keep growing and pay for the 8-year-olds. College, you can change the beneficiary. Or if, like you said, if it does really well and it's doubled in 5 years, well then, yeah, you can go ahead and use that and make it make the investment more conservative and use it for tuition costs. So those are some opportunities. Also, if you have older kids, maybe you forego the 529 if there's no state income tax benefit, and maybe you just do municipal bonds in a brokerage account. Collect tax-free interest and make more than you would in a checking account, but keep it safe from any sort of negative market event.
Yeah. And kind of adding to that, 529 is the Mecca funding account, but we talked about Coverdell ESAs, but that's not the only way you could set aside funds for your child's future, right? You could fund a UGMA or a UTMA. You could also fund a Roth IRA if the kid has employment income. Yeah, which is also valuable. So
you can use a Roth IRA for education expenses. Remember that.
Yeah. So there's not a one size fits all. And it's really it really comes down to, what are your values of your of the family? What are you committed to paying? What are the odds that you could pay out of pocket in the event that things don't materialize in the way you think they will? And what are the potential outcomes? Because we've seen clients where, they'll set aside a certain amount of money for a kid's education, and in the event that they get scholarships or choose a less expensive option, the parent likes the idea of having the flexibility to leverage that money to start their professional career off, or to put a down payment on a home, or to pay for a wedding. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all, and a 529 isn't the silver bullet, but there's lots of planning opportunities and nuance there. Is there anything you add to that, Justin, in terms of planning opportunities?
I don't think so. I love this. So what are the 3 points? The value of a degree, figuring out what's important to you, what is the optimal decision in terms of where to go, what to study. Value of a degree, 529, and then planning opportunities. It really is a critical topic that affects a ton of people. Let us know if you have any questions. I love this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And the last thing I'll say, alignment is so important, right? A great call to action before you kind of contemplate and calculate any of this is getting on the same page of your spouse of, hey, what do we think is a reasonable amount to spend in light of our experiences? Because I see lots of clients who they paid their way through college and they love the idea of their kids having sweat equity, which I totally get and understand. And that was a part of my college situation as well. And some people had college paid for them and loved it and want to do the same for their kids. And some parents had college paid for them and want their kids to have sweat equity. So getting on the same page about what you're willing to spend is a great starting point, even before you begin to value it. It's such an important planning topic because it can become super emotional and it's super expensive. And at the intersection of any of those two things, it's ripe for mismanagement. So thank you for the question. We'll see you next time.